Oil drilling over the last century has made and remade the Gulf Coast. Our economy, culture, and even where we live have been deeply tied to the oil and gas industry and the drilling of fossil fuels. Since we started drilling, technology has changed rapidly, but old drilling tech doesn't disappear when the well dries up. Advances in fracking and offshore drilling in particular have made older platforms obsolete, but it doesn't mean they're gone. These structures remain, sometimes causing environmental harms, as we've discussed in previous episodes, but sometimes these platforms can be re engineered to serve as environmental habitats. On today's show, we bring you the third in our series on oil technology histories as we explore how repurposed oil rigs have been deployed over the last decades as artificial reefs. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and the Associate Director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the Associate Director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder, you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Dr. Dolly Jørgensen is our guest today. She's an expert historian who's been working extensively on oil technologies and is the perfect person to tell us about how oil rigs have been repurposed in the Gulf Coast as natural habitats. Joining me for today's conversation is also our former researcher, Caroline Pollan.
Dr. Jørgensen, welcome to Gulf Streams. Could you just introduce yourself, quickly, a little about your work and, and your fascinating kind of historian approach to some of these broader environmental issues for our listeners?
Sure, Weston. Happy to be here today. So Dolly Jørgensen, professor of history at the University of Stavanger, and that's in Norway. And I work in environmental history, the relationship of environment and technology. So how do we think about things like infrastructure and technology, and what do those do for relations? So often I've looked then at the relations with animals. And in a way, that's where this research that I've been doing into the oil industry comes from. So you say, well, that's kind of an odd move, but rigs to reefs, as we'll talk about, is really about the fact that oil infrastructure becomes unintentionally a home for all kinds of ocean critters to start with. And then what do people do about that? How do people respond?
And you didn't mention it, I don't think, but you're actually working on a book, I think, right now, all about kind of these oil histories and rigs to reef. And so, I mean, this is so totally in your wheelhouse, and I'm delighted to get to chat with you because, yeah, as soon as you said pigs, I'm like, ooh, pigs, fish. Okay, I see where the through line is.
Yeah, well, exactly. So they seem really different, and especially because, well, that's actually on medieval pigs, quite a different time period from pigs today. I actually started out as a medieval historian, but always looking at environmental issues. And in fact, my work for my PhD was on technological infrastructure and sanitation in the city. So all along, all of my work has dealt both with animals, which often feature in sanitation, and technology. And so I've just moved kind of time periods. I've decided not to constrain myself in that way, but instead to think about these as environmental issues that in fact span across all kinds of time frames. And, there are some different historical research techniques you need to use when you're doing medieval things versus modern things. But in many ways, people are still just people and respond to their environments in, using the tools that they have available to them.
Absolutely. All right. So let's dive in a little bit here to this oil and gas history. So just to start us off, I think in the Gulf of Mexico, we have this kind of notion. It's oil and gas is so enmeshed in culture in this part of the world. It's such a part of how people in the Gulf tend to think of themselves. It's a huge industry across the region. But it wasn't always like this. And especially drilling in the Gulf of Mexico itself is actually fairly recent in our history. So can you walk us through just a little bit? How did underwater drilling first become prominent? How did the Gulf of Mexico in particular become such a hot spot for this kind of work? And, and thinking about where these programs that we'll talk about, like Rigs to Reef in a bit, start, I mean, it really starts with this beginning of actual drilling in the Gulf.
Right. And so the first kind of movement to go into water, right? So not drilling an oil well on land, but in water is really in California and the near shore wells that they would drill. And in that case, they basically had piers that you could walk out to. So in other words, it wasn't deep water, but it was water nevertheless. And that's kind of where things start. In the Gulf of Mexico, they installed the first offshore platform in 1946.
Wow.
So it is after World War II that you get the first one, and it's 5 miles offshore of Morgan City, Louisiana. But if you know things about Louisiana, you realize that the water is not very deep, a long ways offshore because of the kind of mud flats that are created there. So you need to go out in a boat to get to these early offshore platforms, even though they're not in particularly deep water themselves. So, and that becomes the standard. And what makes that special in the Gulf of Mexico is that there are a lot of platforms that are actually within an easy boat ride for recreational fishermen to go out to, because that's where all these first and early platforms get put in, is kind of this relatively close to shore, but you need a boat, not super deep water. So we're not talking about the thousands of feet of water that are now, most of our wells are going in a deep water. So you're thousands of feet deep. They're huge, huge, huge structures, but that's not where it starts, right? So when you establish these structures, what happened is that basically by the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, it had become known that they made great fishing holes. So the locals, who were all primarily involved in the offshore oil industry, they were working for them, or they're working as suppliers for them, machiners for them, whatever. So both the people who work offshore and the people who work onshore, but for the industry, they have boats and they go out fishing. And people figure out real fast that the fish catches are pretty good around these platforms.
Oh yeah, fisher people they're gonna find the good fishing real fast.
Exactly. So and of course, the word of mouth spreads, and you figure out that this, going rig fishing is a thing that you do. And there are these some historical pictures that Louisiana has where you see a pleasure boat where they're going to do the deep sea line fishing, and they tie up to platforms.
Wow.
So keep your boat still, and there you are next to this platform. It's not that they went on the platforms, mind you, but they used them as anchor, and because that's where the fish were. Now and then you kind of go, why are the fish there? Well, most of the Gulf of Mexico in this nearshore region is a muddy, relatively flat, sparse bottom. There's not a whole lot there. I mean, there'll be some rocky outcrops. There'll be some, kind of formations like that might attract life to settle. But in general, it's this kind of soft mud. Well, what an offshore oil structure did is it provides a hard place for a lot of these sessile organisms. So corals, mollusks, barnacles, to all settle in the larval stage because it's something that's hard. Right? So they're just floating around the ocean, something hard you can attach, and the more of them attach, and you kind of make this coral reef structure in and of themselves by attaching themselves to offshore oil. And this happens both with kind of standing platforms, but also with things like pipelines that are running on the bottom. If you go down and take a ROV and you look at them, you'll see that all kinds of organisms are attached to these things because they're hard, unlike the mud. And what happens then is this stuff all attaches and gets hard, and then that's attractive for particularly young fish as places to hide. Right? So you're a little fish and you can hide and you can have food and you are safe. And so that means you're going to attract bigger fish because there's little fish around, and so you end up making this whole habitat where fish are attracted to the structure. Now, I will just say that there have been debates ever since people realized this and started doing scientific studies in the 1970s. That's when people got interested from a science perspective on these biological hotspots, you could say, of these offshore oil structures, about whether it is that fish are just attracted there from somewhere else, or if there's actually more fish because of them. So is it that there's more fish in the ocean?
Yeah.
Or is it that you just know where the fish are? And ocean science is really hard about this. I mean, it's really difficult because, of course, you can't be everywhere at one time. You can't measure like, here's all the fish in the ocean.
It's
right?
like you're saying the ocean is vast or something.
Right, exactly. So this debate continues to this day. If you look in the scientific literature, people can continuously publish articles one way or the other. Here, this is productive, and then here, this is attractive. So this is called the attraction production debate, and I don't know if it'll ever be solved, but what you can say is certainly that these oil structures have fish around them. People know then that they have the fish around them, particularly then the species that are interesting for recreational fishermen. So things like red snapper or amberjack, these kind of recreational fishing species that you catch with deep water lines, so casting out.
And you're listing some of a Louisiana fisherman's favorite catches there. So,
and in fact, I mean, my favorite thing probably in the whole world is that there actually was an advertisement run that said exactly this. So an it was quite telling. This advertisement, okay, if you picture it, has at the top a catch of the day menu board.
okay.
And then it lists all of these species that are catch of the day, including shark, which of course nowadays you wouldn't catch, but I mean, at the time it was still, I guess, legal to catch. But anyway, and then underneath this, red snapper, shark, mahi-mahi, silver trout, this is a Phillips ad from 1994. Under this catch of the day board, it says, every day people seem to be writing about the work we've done in the Gulf of Mexico. And saying that the company then was responsible for this fisherman's paradise, they call it, which was created by a submerged Phillips petroleum production platform. So this list of species is precisely then mobilized as a way to say that these platforms, whether standing or then later intentionally becoming reefs, are producing the things that fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico want.
Speaking about how these fish are attracted to these oil rigs, there's things, little critters and small species of fish and larger species of fish and corals and shellfish that are growing on these oil rigs. It brings to mind artificial reefs. We've talked in the past on Gulf Streams about using rocks and old shells to cultivate artificial oyster reefs. And I was wondering if you could talk about the idea of artificial reefs and their benefits, perhaps. We talked about the increased fish catch in the Gulf of Mexico and who supports these artificial reefs.
Yes, exactly. So what happens then is that since these oil platforms were standing and recreational fishermen used them, they could see that fish were around them. There start to be discussions then in the late 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, about, well, shouldn't we make artificial reefs out of these structures? Because obviously they're reefs. I mean, they function as reefs when they're standing. So they would be good structures to leave in place. And this comes particularly at a moment when the oil companies have started for the first time really removing structures from the Gulf of Mexico. So if you will, they started in the 1940s and 50s, and they're putting in structures and putting in more in the 60s, and then things are finally getting to the end of their useful life. And so they start coming out. Well, what happens is all these fishermen who go out to their favorite spots find that all of a sudden their favorite spot isn't there anymore because that platform has been decommissioned and it's been removed. And so there becomes a thinking that, well, but these platforms obviously are being reefs. They should stay as reefs, whether that means they should stay standing there or that they should be reused as reefs in order to make up for the fact that they're removed. So they work on a policy level to get national legislation passed that actually is not rigs to reefs legislation. It doesn't actually say anywhere like, oh, we're rigs to reefs. It's actually about a national artificial reef plan, because there are other artificial reefs going in other parts of the world that have nothing to do with oil, right? It's not that you couldn't have made it out of new things. It's that if you already have something there, it's cheap material. You might even get it for free. And in some cases, like a oil rig, it's already kind of a decent shape because it has these crisscrossy bars, which is kind of what you want for an artificial reef.
Well, and I mean, I think that's we don't think about as much. No, yeah, sorry. Just that there are possibilities for these, spent materials that we would normally just see as this kind of environmental waste or detritus, and instead, finding new useful purposes for it is really fascinating. Caroline, what did you want to hop in with?
Oh yeah, so you mentioned that there are these programs that are starting up using buses and cars and tires, and this rigs to reef as well. So what are where are these programs going? Like, what do you think is the future of these artificial reef programs in the Gulf and elsewhere?
Yeah, so they get started because of this national artificial reef legislation that gets passed in 1984, and then in 1985 they make a plan, if you will, that is for the whole US. Now this is at a very generic level. It basically says, you need to have things like permits. You can't just make an artificial reef wherever you want to. That states need to have mechanisms by which you monitor and apply for these kind of activities. And so then it goes to the states. So then the states who are coastal start thinking about, well, how do we put that into practice? So in Louisiana, they immediately the next year, 1986, passed their own legislation, because of course you have to have instruments to do things as a state. that allows the creation of artificial reefs. And the discussion there is particularly offshore oil. Okay, so because that's what they have. A couple of years later, Texas follows suit and passes theirs. All of these discussions are actually happening simultaneously, but some, take longer than others to kind of get through their processes. So in both Texas and Louisiana, there are plans for making artificial reefs, and these are run by the wildlife and fisheries departments in almost every state. So whatever the official name of their department that runs wildlife and fisheries, that's who's going to get in charge of artificial reefs, because they're for fisheries, right? They're for artificial reefs to be used by particularly recreational fishermen. And it's important to point out, though, in the Gulf of Mexico, when I talk to people about this, they'll automatically assume that the oil companies are doing this with all of their structures, right? They must just be turning them all into reefs. And it's actually not true. About a tenth, so 1 out of every 10 structures that they take out becomes a reefed structure. So it's not actually common. It's not even most of the structures, not even close to most of the structures. So it's a collaborative in Texas and Louisiana. It's a collaborative process between the oil companies and the departments of fish and wildlife, to say that they want that structure as a reef. So it has to be a kind of an appropriate structure for it. And in both of those states, they have designated reef areas. So you can't just make a reef wherever you want in the state waters, but they kind of have on a map, like, okay, well, these 8 areas are the areas in which we can add more structures, because if you will, you keep adding to it, you're making it a bigger, complex reef, and it's marked on the maps. So both for the people who are using it, but also for the commercial fishermen who are primarily trawlers, to not get their nets caught in them. So this was actually the biggest, in the Gulf of Mexico, it was the biggest complaints against the idea of the program came from commercial trawlers.
Oh, interesting.
Because they said they don't want anything on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, because that has a potential to snag their nets, which one can destroy the net, so there's a financial cost. But if they're in a particular kind of situation, you can actually sink your boat in snagging the net. So, and of course, that could lead to loss of life and as well as money. So they were the people against it. The environmentalists in the Gulf of Mexico were for it. The recreational fishermen were for it. So wildlife and fisheries and scientists are for it. The oil companies say, sure, we can let you have them as long as you give us liability transfer. We don't want to be liable for this structure that you're using. We're donating you a structure. You're doing with it what you want. Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. So that's how it is. It's a donation. And for the most part, it's been the fisheries people who've wanted them more than the oil companies who've tried to get rid of them. The one exception that happened was when you ended up with structures getting knocked down by hurricanes.
Oh, interesting.
So a number of these were approved, and that ended up causing a big controversy. And because, of course, these commercial fishermen, again, trawlers, were very unhappy about those structures getting put into the areas in which were not in the already designated reef zone. Right? So they had these ones on the map, and these were outside of those areas. And the trawler said, no, you can't be doing that. You said you were going to take them to these areas. We were okay with that. We're not okay with you just leaving them where they are. So the state level processes had to change. So it forced a change in how they had been doing or allowing in a few cases. So it wasn't very many, but it was enough that it got notice. And you had, kind of information, hearings, going on, and the states decided, okay, we're not going to allow that kind of permit anymore. If it falls down because of a hurricane, you're going to need to take it out. But it's a very long, complicated process to actually, legislatively.
That actually brings me, I want to dig in. I love, you're really thoughtful on discourse around the kind of history of these rigs to reef programs, of how these programs get started, but and also really pushing folks. You mentioned that the environmentalists are actually all for this project. And something that you highlight is, we tend to really kind of think in binaries, that there's environmentalists on one side and fossil fuel companies on the other. And actually, there are interesting spaces where there can be overlaps and there can be, mutual agreement and policies that kind of benefit both parties. And so, in thinking of how oil and gas companies, who I understand, a lot of environmentalists are just immediately suspicious of anything that happens, right? And anything that's said. And there is real strategy towards, part of the understanding here is this is good publicity for oil and gas companies, both in exactly that kind of catch of the day ad you were talking about, but actually in reading one of your articles, you open with this anecdote from the Louisiana Aquarium of the Americas, which is in New Orleans, which longtime listeners on the show will know I'm from New Orleans and have strong ties to the city. And I got to tell you, Dolly, I have been to that aquarium 20 times at least in my life, and never realized that big giant metal thing was supposed to be an oil rig, because I grew up seeing it and wasn't going into the critical mindset and was just like, yeah, that's just, this random big steel platform thing they have in the middle of the fish tank for some reason. And so, it's really kind of fascinating to think both about, there was a concerted effort by oil and gas, but with the support government, especially in the 80s when there was an oil and gas downturn, to think about, this is a way of lessening some costs. This is a save for taxpayers, and the environmentalists like it. There was a kind of coming together in that moment around these programs. And I want to give you some space to talk about both, the kind of lack of productivity around that stark binary when we just think environmental versus industry. But also, about this more broadly around where there are actually interesting spaces for collaboration.
Yeah, this is exactly the case, because the environmentalists in the Gulf of Mexico were very supportive of this movement, because both they saw the fish life around the structures, and they said, well, this is what we are trying to protect. This is what we want more of, and often looked at it as a restoration of the Gulf of Mexico from all of the industrial pollutants that have also caused major fish kills and decrease in biodiversity. So you can see these structures and see the fish life on there, and there's plenty of photographs of these structures under the water that were generated starting in the 1980s to promote, well, to think of this as a living, vibrant ecosystem, which is exactly what the environmentalists want. So they did look at it as a positive, and on top of that, you were reusing material, right? One of the other environmental kind of mantras, reuse, reduce, recycle. Well, this is exactly that, right? Why would you want to just basically have to dispose of this material when in fact you could reuse it for something good? So I think you're exactly right that it's interesting to think about the ways in which different interest groups align um, differently in different histories. So in this case, the environmentalists and the oil companies end up on the same side, and commercial fishing are on a other side. Although they always make a point that they're positive to artificial reefs in the Gulf of Mexico. They just want them to be in a specific area. So they just don't want them everywhere, but they do like the idea of having them. So they're not even anti-reef. They're kind of just anti-everywhere reef. It lines up very differently at that same time, and really going into the 1990s in California, where the environmentalists end up on the same side as the commercial fishing trawlers and have meetings together, because they're both against the oil companies. So because of their specific history of the Santa Barbara oil spill in particular, the Get Oil Out movement, they don't want structures there to be left in place because of exactly this kind of potential for greenwashing that they see. The oil companies put it in, the oil companies need to take it out, and the oil companies need to not get good press for having done so. So they want it out. The commercial trawlers in particular also want it out because the trawlers want to be able to destroy everything themselves. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And so they don't fall on the same lines in different places. And in my study, I also look at the North Sea up here where I'm from, here in Norway, and the UK, which operate the big North Sea basin. And there, the environmentalists are against it, commercial fishermen kind of against it, but there aren't any recreational fishermen at all, because at the distances that these things are out at sea in the North Sea, that's not commercial, it's not recreational fishing area, it's only commercial fishing that happens out there. So you have entirely different, if you will, constituencies that can get made. Whereas out there, though, the oil companies have the experience from the Gulf of Mexico. So they see it, these big multinational companies, they see what they can do in one place and then often think, well, but why are we not doing that somewhere else? But of course, there's a very specific history and context for that place.
Yeah.
So I think context really, it matters. Geographies matter, particular places matter, ways of using the landscape in these things matter tremendously to how the policies shape up and either allow or do not allow rigs to reefs at particular moments in time. And the other thing, as a historian of something that's relatively recent, policy, as you realize, it can change. So in the course of me doing my research on California, it actually changed from it being disallowed to being allowed.
Oh, wow.
Right at the end of when I was publishing an article, I had to go back and like add an epilogue kind of thing. Completely unexpected, but it's because politics changes, right? Yes. Who's in charge changes, which groups they align with and for what reasons change. You had a change of governorship and somebody tried again with legislation and then it passed.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your insight into this. I have to say, doing this research, I was deeply suspect. I have done a lot of research for this show in the past about the Deepwater Horizon spill, for example, these really negative ways that oil impacts the wildlife population in the Gulf of Mexico. So thinking that oil could be good, was something that I was immediately suspicious of. But I think how you mentioned that it's important to sort of look for the solution here, and the solution was leaving these structures in place, even though mining for oil in the Gulf is something that is dangerous to both humans and the wildlife there, because of spills or explosions. These rig structures that were already there, they've become these important habitats, which I think is very cool. I have another question about if you know of any other kinds of programs that are sort of similar to this, where industry and environmental movements are sort of working together in a way for the benefit of ecosystems. Are there other human-made products or after effects? You mentioned the tires and the buses at the bottom of the sea as well, that can have positive environmental impacts or offer models towards generating more healthy ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, great question. Because, yeah, I mean, and we should just note that I think we should separate, I guess, the oil and the structure. So I would never say that the oil itself is like good, or that the oil industry is doing good stuff either. It's that they have already been allowed to do something. So could this structure be used for something useful, is the conversation to have. And then you can decide whether or not you believe, that a artificial reef is a particularly useful thing, which some people would have good arguments for why it's not a useful thing that we should do as well. But yeah, examples of industry and environmentalists working together. I mean, the one that comes to mind really is bottle and can recycling in Scandinavia, where you established a system that benefited the producers of bottles, and then later they make cans, but at the beginning it's bottles, by making infrastructure that they could use to get back their bottles. But you required that they get back the bottles, because if they didn't get back bottles, so in other words, if people threw them in the trash and didn't take it back, then they had to pay basically fines for that. So they were mandated to recycle. And so what happened is you ended up with an entire system of bottle deposits and bottle returns that actually work, unlike in most of the US states, which they don't work. And there are very specific reasons for that, that if you want to know more about, I have a book to recommend by Finnarna Jørgensen called Making Green Machine. But there is this potential for collaboration, for working and saying, well, what do we need to fix? Something like, well, the ozone, the CFCs control is an example of environmentalists working for an issue, and companies coming on board with, well, okay, we're going to have to make changes to the way we do things, and what refrigerants we're going to use, for example. And it did exactly the thing that it was supposed to do. I mean, it was one of the great environmental success stories. But you couldn't have done it without there being companies who made changes to what they were doing, I guess. So I think there are some things like that, but at the same time, you have to be aware that things can go very badly. So the tire reefs in Florida are a good example of this. Millions of tires were put in by people who had the best intentions. They wanted to make these artificial reefs, particularly for recreational fishing, off of basically the Miami-Dade kind of area. And they did it according to the best available, science and design, filling the tires and putting them in big bundles. What turns out to happen is the tires are not a very good material, and they have a tendency to move in
Oh no.
hurricanes and events like this. So instead of the structure kind of like an oil structure is huge and heavy and it's not going anywhere once it's down on the bottom of the ocean, these tires tended to shift and move, and so they've actually both damaged natural reefs that were nearby, but also basically aren't functioning because of the movement. So you need something to hold still if it's going to make a reef, right? So in the case of Florida, you ended up with a multi-million-dollar cleanup effort that had to bring in the US Navy to try and recover these tires that are on the bottom of the ocean. And they only barely started before it got closed down, and COVID, I don't think they've restarted after. But it's a complete mess. And so there you can say, well, here were people who really believed that they were doing the right thing and were doing what at the time was thought to be good design. But you find out later that that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
So time will tell, right? As a historian, you can also say you may do what you think is right. So right now we can say with these artificial reefs out of oil structures that, well, they're functioning as artificial reefs, right? So they have life on them and it's great. Well, maybe in 20 years we're going to find some science that says, and I know there are actually a few people who've already started looking at invasive species, and are there invasive species, for example, from the coral reefs around the Caribbean that are coming further up into the Gulf now because they have homes and they didn't used to, right? So it might be that in the future we figure out that this was a horrible idea too. So nothing is fixed.
Well, hopefully that's not the case. But
yeah, we can hope, because now there's hundreds of them all over the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, but the oil companies won't be the ones who had to clean it up. It would go to the states.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've learned so much talking to you. Especially I didn't realize the importance of policy in all of this. You mentioned that policy is so instrumental to orchestrating that recycling in Scandinavia and in the US. It's, our recycling system could benefit from a little bit better policy. And this policy about these artificial reefs is what's enabling these Rigs to Reef programs. So thank you for that as well. Thank you so much for joining us on Gulf Streams. And providing us with this insight into this important story about fossil fuels and the Gulf, and how these oil rigs are, staying around to maybe do a little bit of good after a whole lot of taking oil out of the Gulf.
Now, as a Halloween treat, we're going to go to our researcher, Jadyn, who has a piece all about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the environmental origins and major ideas that run through the book.
Hi everyone! As you know, we're nearing the end of October, which means we're that much closer to trick-or-treating, fun costumes, and of course, scary stories. So in the spirit of Halloween, today we're going to dive into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Today I'm joined by Taylin Nelson, a PhD candidate at Rice University, who has actually written a piece about Frankenstein and eco-anxiety. So I couldn't imagine a more perfect person to have this conversation with, so thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me, Jadyn. It's lovely to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about Frankenstein because it's my favorite book, so...
Yay! So I just want to jump off by asking a broad question, which would be, how do you think that Frankenstein and the environment are connected?
Great question. Thanks, Jadyn. So, actually, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has a really famous what's the term? A very famous conception story which is how the novel was conceived. It's almost as famous as the book itself, I would say. And so during the spring of 1815 in Indonesia, Mount Tambora, a volcano, erupted, and it caused like kind of massive global environmental change. So like killing an estimated 71,000 people, displacing many people in the Indonesian area. Tambora's kind of more planetary effects. It caused monsoon seasons in India, flooding in China, and everywhere some level of crop failure was taking place. Even like snow in summertime in New England.
Wow.
And so the year kind of came to be known as a year without a summer. And this actually impacted the conception of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because when it was written, Mary Shelley was in Geneva along with her boyfriend Percy Shelley, infamous poet Lord Byron, Lord Byron's physician John Polidori, and her half-sister Claire Claremont. They all arrived to spend the summer in this Villa Diodati, and they thought it would be wonderful weather, but it was the opposite. It was torrential rains, no sun, so it drove them indoors, and that meant that they had to spend a lot of time doing indoor activities like reading. So they were reading lots of ghost stories, and that's actually what inspired them to have a ghost storytelling contest, which is what led to Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein. So in some ways, this kind of idea of climate change and environment really impacted the writing of the book itself.
Great, thank you so much. So now jumping off into our next question, I'd love to hear your thoughts on eco-anxiety. Since the American Psychological Association now considers eco-anxiety a psychological consequence of environmental problems that affect the planet, do you think that eco-anxiety can give us a different perspective on Frankenstein and subsequently why we feel a sense of dread when discussing climate change?
Ooh, this is a great question. Well, I think the place that I'd like to start is just like, what are the feelings that you feel when you think of climate change?
I think first and foremost, fear.
Yeah.
It's scary. It's not something that just one person can fix. And so we're relying on the whole world to also make this problem a priority. So I would say fear, a bit of anxiety, because I don't know, I think when you're scared of something, it also gives you a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem that exceeds any one individual. The scale of the Anthropocene is so beyond any kind of fault that can be placed on, like I said, any individual at this point. And it really is something that I think we can't deal with alone. You know, I think we feel a sense of dread because we fear for a future that we don't know. And I think that the environment is really connected to who we are as people. You know, obviously, you know, our upbringings, our parents influence how we move through the world, but also the environment that we are raised in influences us. And everyone has different ideas about nature and what that means. But, you know, I take, for example, like the glaciers, the inland glaciers in Switzerland that are melting right now. And the kind of communities that live in these towns next to these glaciers are kind of experiencing like a sort of cultural identity crisis because they have been there for so long. It kind of defines who they are as a people. And so there's this sense of dread and not knowing who we are moving into the future if the places that we have grown up in or love begin to change and look like something we haven't seen before. So I think in that sense, definitely there's a feeling of uneasiness when discussing climate change.
Right.
And if we wanted to bring that to Frankenstein, I think generally the time period is like really interested in kind of talking about weather and like especially extreme weather. And so like when I look up eco-anxiety, some of the symptoms are obsessive thoughts, fatalist thinking. So that's definitely stuff that works its way into Gothic literature, just generally, you know, like a storm that causes, you know, a wanderer to have to go to the haunted castle.
Right.
But in particular in Frankenstein, and when I think about like how eco-anxiety could give me a different perspective on Frankenstein, I'm thinking back to like the first time I read the book, and I didn't feel uneasy when Victor's creature came to life, which is kind of like one of those really pivotal scenes. I didn't feel uncomfortable by the descriptions about the creature or anything. Actually, the first moment that I really felt uncomfortable and uneasy is when Victor and the creature confront each other for the first time on top of a mountain. And they're having this conversation, and the creature is begging Victor to kind of take responsibility, to take care of him and guide him through life, because he's basically a newborn. He doesn't understand the world, and no one will accept him as well because of how he looks. And Victor just kind of has this really blasé like approach. He doesn't care about the creature's pleas for humanity and for acceptance, and that really made me uneasy. And so I think, like, in terms of thinking about climate change, one thing that could connect to like the present time is, you know, the people that we hear about on social media, on the news, sometimes our families, who just don't believe that either climate change is real or that they have any kind of responsibility in attending to those issues, maybe because they're not, you know, going to be around long enough to experience those consequences, or they just maybe don't believe it's real, that it's happening.
Right, for sure. Well, hopefully in the coming years that will begin to shift a little bit, and it will be a bigger issue that everybody cares about. So, since I'd love to connect romanticism to Frankenstein and the environment if possible, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this quote. It says, "I desire the company of a man who would sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. You may deem me a romantic, my dear sister, but I bitterly feel the want of a friend." So, do you think that Walton's admission could reflect present-day eco-anxiety, loneliness, and the sense of hopelessness about mitigating all of these environmental issues and decline?
Absolutely. I think, like, what's really fascinating about romanticism as a period of kind of artistic and literary expression is this sense of needing to return to a kind of idealistic, nostalgic, and remote nature space. So we have kind of industrialization happening, burgeoning capitalistic, growing world. And so there's this sense of dread and a need to escape to quote unquote remote nature.
Right.
And so what's really defines romanticism is man alone in nature. Like if you think about the kind of really famous image of the man standing on the cliff, and his back is to the viewers, and he's looking out onto like the clouds that are spreading before him. And that kind of really typifies like this idea of man not only being in nature but also dominant and over nature. And what's really interesting about this quote that you pulled then is there's this sense of that's, I think, the opposite of romanticism's kind of classic trope.
Right.
And maybe that's because Mary Shelley wrote it, right? And she has this sense of desiring, you know, company and someone who would sympathize with her, right? And I mean, she's imbuing this in her characters. But I think what that really speaks to is also how we need each other if we're going to enact any kind of meaningful change in the future in terms of climate change and who it will be impacting. And I think it's, like I said, it's beyond any one person's fault at this point. And so we just need to kind of come together and work together and try to make this world as livable as we can for as long as we can.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your insight on that.
Finally, Jadyn will tell you how to get involved this week in Houston.
Hey y'all, I hope you're doing well. If you're still looking for ways to get involved in the community next week, consider volunteering with one of these incredible organizations. On October 29th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., the Coastal Prairie Conservancy is seeking passionate volunteers to aid in the preservation of the native nursery. This opportunity occurs every Tuesday and Friday, so consider joining the individuals at the Indian Grass Preserve. Get your hands dirty and contribute to the success of the prairie by doing vital restoration work. This experience will allow you to grow native species like planting wildflowers and various types of grass. You'll also be able to maintain trails and remove invasive species and, of course, partake in any minor renovations that may be needed around the property. No experience is necessary to participate and tools are provided, but make sure to dress appropriately. If this excites you, then check out the Texas Naturalist website volunteer page for more information. Alternatively, if you're looking for a fun way to start off your Halloween, on October 31st from 8:30 a.m. to 11:30, start off your day with a guided walk to explore the birds of John Paul Landing Park. This is a great way to connect with nature and perhaps persuade you to do future environmental volunteer work. All ages are welcome, though it should be noted that this is a 2-mile loop. Make sure that you dress properly for the weather, slather on that sunscreen, and pack lots of water. And lastly, if you would like to have an impact on the community but unsure where to start, we've got you covered. All year long, the Houston Parks and Recreation Department relies on volunteers just like you to assist in a multitude of activities, ranging from helping the local sports teams to large-scale cleanup projects in neighborhood parks. If you're still looking for ways to get involved, go to the Houston Parks and Recreation page and consider signing up to picking up litter, planting trees, or if you're really feeling adventurous, adopting a park. I hope one of these opportunities encourages you to get involved in the Houston environment next week. So with that, I hope you guys all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about the state of environmental education. Finally, a big thanks to Carter Dean for composing our new theme music. We hope you enjoy that. If you have any questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave us a voicemail at 713-348-4081. That's 713-348-4081, or email us at westonT@rice.edu. Quick reminder, you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms, and if you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Caroline Pollan, Jadyn Brayboy, Sophia Soltez, and Nauman Rutzdorf. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.